He opened his hotel door expecting a maid. What he found was a 7-year-old girl with a rag and no fear. That moment shattered everything Brandon Ellis thought he knew about success, and led him to the one thing he'd never built, a family. Before we get started, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from so we can say hello to you. Now, on to the story. Brandon Ellis had never opened his own hotel room door. In the world he'd built, corner offices, private jets, 5-star hotels, things like that were handled by staff. Luxury, after all, came with a code: invisibility of labor, silence in service, and distance between power and need. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, something made him pause. Something about the soft, uncertain knock on the door of his penthouse suite tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. He rose from his sleek glass desk where he'd been finalizing a deal for a resort in Singapore. The knock came again, not loud, not urgent, just hesitant. Almost polite. Expecting a housekeeping staffer or perhaps a tray left behind, Brandon swung the door open without a second thought. But what he saw made the air freeze in his lungs. Brandon Ellis stood frozen in the doorway, unable to fully process what he was seeing. He blinked once, then again, as if his eyes had betrayed him. But the image didn't change. Standing there in the plush hallway of the most exclusive floor of his own hotel, designed for elite executives and royalty, was a little girl. No taller than his waist. No older than 7. Her brown hair was tangled into a low, careless ponytail, and her oversized maid's apron hung loosely over a faded red cotton dress that had clearly been washed too many times. In her small hand, she clutched a rag like it was the most normal thing in the world. She wasn't scared. She wasn't lost. In fact, she looked focused. Brandon's voice caught in his throat before he managed to ask, "Are you lost?" The girl shook her head firmly. "No, sir. I'm here to clean your room." His brows drew together. "You work here?" She nodded like it was the most obvious thing. "Yes, mister. I'm assigned to this floor today." Brandon stepped aside instinctively, his body moving before his brain could catch up. As she entered the suite, she moved with a strange kind of confidence, not the kind that came from arrogance, but from repetition, from knowing exactly what to do and how to do it. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around in wonder at the $10,000 chandelier or the velvet armchairs. She just walked in and got to work, setting her small supply bag against the wall and moving straight toward the bed to smooth out the sheets. Brandon stood still, unsure whether to be stunned or furious. He wasn't the kind of man to tolerate mistakes, much less negligence like this. This was his flagship hotel, and there was a child, doing maid service like she belonged on the payroll. And yet, somehow, she did seem to belong. She moved like she'd done this 100 times before. No wasted motions. No questions. Just quiet determination. For a man who had built his empire on control, nothing about this moment made sense. His first instinct was to call downstairs, to demand answers. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her fingers carefully tucked the corners of the sheet. Or maybe it was the way she didn't once look up for approval. Whatever it was, Brandon Ellis realized, this wasn't just wrong. It was heartbreaking. And he needed to know how this little girl ended up cleaning his suite like it was the only way to survive. Brandon Ellis couldn't believe what he was seeing. The luxury hotel suite he paid thousands a night for, immaculate, sleek, and always maintained with silent professionalism, was now being cleaned by a child who looked like she should be in 2nd grade, not wiping down windows with a rag half her size. He stood frozen for a moment longer, then instinctively reached for the hotel phone, the polished receiver feeling heavier than usual in his hand. "This is Ellis in 2507, he said, voice tight, struggling to contain the storm building in his chest. "Can someone please explain why there's a child cleaning my room?" There was a pause on the other end. The receptionist's tone shifted from cheerful to cautious. "One moment, sir. I'll connect you with Mr. Langston. The line clicked, then crackled. Mr. Ellis, came the voice of Mark Langston, the hotel manager, polished but uneasy. Good afternoon. I understand there's been a bit of confusion. Confusion? Brandon snapped, moving toward the window as if the skyline of Chicago could calm him. There's a little girl scrubbing my linens. Is this part of your new luxury branding strategy? Child labor? Langston hesitated. Her name is Macy Carter. She's part of our extended housekeeping program. Her case is unique. Brandon turned slowly to face Macy, who was now dusting a lamp with small, deliberate strokes. She's alone, he said flatly. No badge. No supervisor. No explanation. Langston cleared his throat. Her grandmother worked here for years. Macy steps in occasionally when. I don't want excuses, Brandon cut in, each word laced with restrained fury. I want answers. The silence that followed felt heavier than the thick carpeting under his feet. Brandon ended the call before Langston could stammer through more corporate jargon. His hand shook slightly as he placed the phone back on the receiver. He looked at Macy again. She wasn't flustered, wasn't even blinking in his direction. She hummed quietly to herself, wiping dust from a lamp worth more than most people made in a month. The casual grace with which she moved made Brandon's stomach twist. He'd built his empire on order, control, and prestige. But this raw, human moment in the middle of his luxury, wasn't just uncomfortable. It was shattering. This wasn't confusion. It was failure. Not hers. Theirs. His. And for the first time in years, Brandon Ellis didn't know what to do. Watching the tiny girl cross the threshold into his luxury hotel suite as if she had every right to be there. Macy Carter didn't wait for permission or glance over her shoulder for approval. She simply walked in, calm, composed, and terrifyingly small in a place so vast and gleaming. Her faded red dress skimmed her knees, and her tiny sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. She moved like someone who had done this before, not once, not twice, but countless times. And not for fun. For survival. Brandon's mouth was slightly open as he watched her take out a rag from her bag and begin smoothing the already immaculate bedsheets. There was a kind of haunted efficiency to her motions, a practiced silence that screamed louder than any protest. He hadn't moved. Not from the door, not from his stunned posture. He was still in his tailored suit, still holding the hotel directory he'd been skimming moments before the knock. But now it felt absurd, every part of it. He was a man who lived in spreadsheets and quarterly growth charts, and yet he couldn't make sense of the child who had just started dusting the corners of his $5,000 coffee table. The room was too quiet, except for the soft swish of her rag and the low hum of the air conditioning. It was that silence that finally snapped something in him. He was used to being in control of everything, his time, his staff, even the temperature of his hotel lobbies. But this? This little girl with no badge, no adult in sight, and no hesitation had just shattered that control like glass. He took a step back, running a hand down his face, then moved toward the hotel phone. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but with a furious kind of disbelief. When the front desk transferred him to the manager, Brandon's voice was cold, sharp. There's a child cleaning my room. He could hear Macy humming now, softly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. She wasn't scared. She wasn't sneaky. She belonged here, or at least, she believed she did. And that broke something wide open in Brandon's chest. Because somewhere deep down, past the luxury and status, past the efficiency and money, Brandon Ellis recognized the truth: this child wasn't trespassing. She was surviving. And the worst part? No one else had even noticed. Brandon Ellis had walked through thousands of luxury hotel corridors in his lifetime, but he had never once stepped foot below the polished, guest-facing floors of his own empire. The executive suite sparkled. The lobbies shimmered. Everything was calculated and designed to perfection. But beneath it all, literally, was a world he'd chosen not to see. Until now. The elevator descended past the main floors and dinged open to reveal something entirely different. The lighting here was dimmer, the air thicker with the scent of bleach, soap, and exhaustion. No soft music played down here. No orchids in vases. Just metal carts clanking down linoleum hallways and the steady buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. He ignored the startled glances from staff members hustling through their tasks. Most of them didn't recognize him out of his usual suit and entourage. But a few did, and froze in mid-stride, unsure whether to greet him or flee. Brandon didn't stop. His steps carried a silent intensity as he made his way through a maze of storage rooms, laundry bins, and supply racks, until he reached the small housekeeping office tucked into the back. Inside, Rosa Martinez stood at a long folding table, sorting stacks of linens into labeled bins. She looked up and gasped slightly when she saw who had entered. "Mr. Ellis," she said quickly, standing straighter, eyes widening. "Is something wrong?" "I'm not here for pleasantries," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I want to know about Macy Carter." Rosa hesitated, her hands faltering on the folded towels. "Macy, she's a good girl. Works harder than anyone. But, sir, it's not what it looks like." "Then explain it to me," Brandon said, crossing his arms, his jaw tight. Rosa glanced around the empty room as if afraid someone might overhear. Her voice dropped. Her grandmother, Darlene, worked here for almost 20 years. Raised Macy by herself. No parents in the picture. A couple years back, Darlene had a stroke. Couldn't clean rooms anymore. But she refused to leave staff housing, it's all she had. So Macy stepped in. She started helping. At first just folding towels, then making beds. She said they didn't have food. She was 7, Mr. Ellis. 7. Brandon's throat clenched. And no one stopped her. Rosa's eyes filled. "We didn't have the power." Mark Langston knew. He looked the other way. Brandon stared at the wall, the shift schedules, the handwritten supply lists. Everything down here ran because people like Rosa carried it. Because children like Macy shouldn't have to. "Where do they live?" he asked quietly. Rosa sighed. "Edge of town. Unit 2C. But please, don't scare her. She's had enough of that already." Brandon didn't answer. He just turned and walked out, heart pounding, fists clenched, not out of anger, but because something inside him had just cracked wide open. Brandon drove through the city in silence, his hands clenched around the steering wheel, jaw set tighter with every passing block. The address Rosa Martinez had given him didn't lead to a place he'd expect someone connected to his luxury empire to call home. The buildings thinned as the glint of downtown glass turned into rows of weathered apartments, some with boarded-up windows and faded signs clinging to rusted poles. He parked in front of a cracked gray complex, its paint peeling like bark from a dying tree. The buzzing hallway lights flickered above as he climbed the narrow staircase to Unit 2C. When he knocked, there was no answer. He tried again, louder this time. After what felt like a full minute, the door creaked open. Macy Carter stood there barefoot, wearing a t-shirt that clearly belonged to someone twice her size. She clutched a cloudy plastic cup of water in both hands like it was something precious. Her hair was tangled from sleep, but her eyes were clear, watchful, not afraid. As if she'd been expecting him. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. Brandon's breath caught for a moment. There was no accusation in her tone. No surprise either. Just quiet, resigned certainty, as though grown men in suits often came knocking, not to yell, not to threaten, but to witness what the world had decided to forget. He looked past her. Inside, the apartment was sparse to the point of haunting. A mattress lay on the floor by the window where an elderly woman, Darlene, lay sleeping. Her chest rose and fell with slow, labored effort. A single chair sat next to a wobbly card table. No TV. No fridge. Just the bare bones of survival. "Why didn't you tell someone?" he asked softly. Macy shrugged. "We tried. But no one listened. Or they left." He stepped into the apartment. The air was stale and heavy. One narrow window barely let in light. A rickety bed sat against the far wall, and on it lay an elderly woman, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. A single lamp flickered on the counter, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and a stack of unpaid medical bills tucked beside an empty pill bottle. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Brandon asked softly, his voice nearly cracking. Macy's gaze didn't waver. "We tried. But no one listened. Or they left." That answer hit harder than any corporate failure ever had. She didn't even sound bitter, just factual. As if she had accepted that the world didn't care unless you forced it to. Brandon knelt so he was eye level with her. "Well, I'm listening now." And for the first time in years, he wasn't the one in charge, the one giving orders. He was the one being let in. This wasn't a hotel suite with luxury linens and polished floors. This was a crumbling apartment with a child who had done more surviving in 7 years than most adults in their lifetimes. He looked at her, truly looked, and knew this wasn't going to be a one-time gesture. He had walked through a door, but what lay beyond it was a responsibility far greater than he'd ever anticipated. And he wasn't walking back out. Brandon Ellis stood just inside the door of apartment 2C, the metallic scent of old pipes mixing with the stale air of neglect. The hallway behind him was dim, but the room in front of him was darker still. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, absorbing everything. The apartment was barely more than a box, one tiny kitchen, one bed, a cracked window letting in a sliver of late afternoon light. The wallpaper was peeling, the carpet was frayed, and the only source of warmth came from a rusted space heater humming in the corner. On the bed, covered in a thin blanket, lay an elderly woman, frail, silent, her breathing shallow and uneven. This was Darlene. Macy's grandmother. Brandon's throat tightened. Macy didn't flinch under the weight of his gaze. She stood barefoot on the cold linoleum floor, still holding a half-empty plastic cup of water. Her oversized t-shirt, hanging off one shoulder, looked like it had belonged to an old staff uniform. She didn't apologize for the mess. She didn't explain. She simply looked up at him with those big brown eyes that held too much understanding for someone so small. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Brandon asked softly, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Macy shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "We tried. People didn't listen. Or they left." The words hit him like a punch. The child's calmness made it worse. She had no idea how wrong this all was, or maybe she did, and that made it even more heartbreaking. Brandon knelt slowly to meet her eye to eye. "Well, I'm listening now." Macy didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether this man, this stranger, meant it. In that moment, Brandon felt something inside him shift. This wasn't about a girl who'd shown up with a rag in a luxury suite. This wasn't about protocol or rules. It was about a child who had been carrying a burden no child ever should. He looked around again, the empty cabinets, the stack of unpaid medical bills on the counter, the brittle quiet of the home. This was a place built on survival, not comfort. But that changed now. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't have to. As Macy turned back to tend gently to her grandmother, Brandon stood still in the doorway, realizing that the knock on his hotel door wasn't just an interruption, it was a call. And for the first time in years, he answered. Brandon Ellis sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, parked in silence on a street lined with cracked sidewalks and sagging utility poles. The air inside the vehicle was still, heavy, as though the dust and despair from Macy's apartment had followed him in. He stared ahead, hands resting on the steering wheel, but his mind was racing, his heart pounding in a rhythm that felt foreign to him. Moments ago, he'd stepped out of a world he knew intimately, five-star suites, marble lobbies, crystal glasses clinking in executive lounges, and into another that shattered something inside him. He had seen the bare cupboards, the paper-thin walls, the stack of unpaid medical bills, and a child trying to carry the weight of 2 lifetimes. And now, sitting alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of a city that kept moving while people like Macy fell through the cracks, Brandon realized he couldn't walk away. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers, opened his notes app, and began typing. Not a speech, not an investor summary, just a list. But it might as well have been a battle plan. Groceries. New mattress. Medical supplies. In-home nurse. School enrollment. Legal counsel, for guardianship. He paused after typing that last item, his thumb hovering over the screen. Guardianship. The word felt enormous. Final. Dangerous, even. But it also felt like the only honest step forward. He didn't know exactly what it would take, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. Just then, Macy's voice echoed in his mind. Then how will we eat? She hadn't asked it with tears or fear. She'd asked it with brutal honesty, like someone who had long stopped believing in promises. And Brandon, a man who had once convinced entire boards to bet billions on his vision, had no rehearsed answer. Just the truth. You'll eat because I said you will. And because you deserve to be a kid. His grip tightened on the phone. This wasn't charity. This wasn't guilt. It was responsibility, for not noticing sooner, for letting someone fall between the cracks of the empire he built. But now that he saw her, he couldn't unsee her. He wouldn't. He hit save on the note. The list was just the beginning. He didn't know how yet. But he knew he would not fail her. Not Macy. Not this time. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was still painted with the pale hues of early light when Brandon Ellis pulled up in front of the aging apartment building. He wasn't in a suit today, just a navy pullover and jeans. No assistants. No briefcase. Only a pair of warm breakfast bags in his hands and a purpose in his chest that wouldn't let him sleep the night before. When Macy Carter opened the door, she looked as if she'd just rolled out of bed, hair tousled, her oversized t-shirt slipping off one shoulder, one sock on, one off. But more than that, she looked surprised. Not because he was there, but because someone had come back. Still, she said nothing. Just blinked. Brandon smiled gently. Good morning. Thought you might want something other than crackers today. Real breakfast, pancakes, eggs, and orange juice. Made by actual chefs. She took the bag slowly, peered inside, then looked up, trying to hide the flicker of gratitude on her face. Thanks, she mumbled, almost too quietly to hear. She sat at the chipped kitchen table and began to eat, no small talk, no questions, just silence filled with the sound of her fork scraping the plate. Meanwhile, Brandon stepped into the back room where Darlene lay, her face pale and sunken into the thin pillow. The nurse he had arranged was already there, gently adjusting the older woman's position and jotting notes on a clipboard. She's stable, but very weak, the nurse said softly. We'll make her comfortable. It's going to take time, but she's a fighter. Brandon nodded, watching the frail woman for a long moment. He had led billion-dollar negotiations, faced down shareholders and pressed junkets without blinking. But now, standing in this dim room, he felt unsteady. Not because he was unsure of what to do, but because he was finally sure of what mattered. Back in the kitchen, Macy was waiting, her plate clean, juice half gone, eyes focused on him. Ready for your first day? He asked. "I don't have school clothes," she said, blunt and unapologetic. "You do now," Brandon replied, placing the new backpack on the table. She opened it cautiously, finding a pair of jeans, a blue sweatshirt, socks, and small sneakers that looked just her size. At the bottom was a pencil case, a notebook with her name on it in careful handwriting. She looked up at him again, the wall between them cracking just slightly. "Thank you," she said, and this time, it meant everything. She changed quickly in the other room. The jeans were a little long, the hoodie too clean against her weathered skin, but when she stepped out, Brandon saw something different in her. Not transformation. Not yet. But the first seed of it. As they walked to the car waiting outside, Brandon opened the door and let her in, glancing at the building behind them. The apartment wasn't much. But this moment? It felt like the beginning of something better. Something real. And for the first time in a long time, Brandon Ellis didn't feel like a hotel mogul. He felt like a guardian. The car rolled to a gentle stop outside the school gates, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Brandon Ellis turned to look at Macy, who sat beside him in the back seat, her small hands clutched tightly around the straps of her brand-new backpack. She hadn't said much during the drive. Instead, she'd stared quietly out the window, watching the world blur past, her reflection flickering in the glass like a ghost of the girl she'd had to be for too long. Brandon's voice broke the silence, warm but cautious. "Ready?" Macy didn't answer right away. She was staring at the school building now, its tall brick walls, bright windows, and the small crowd of children already gathering near the entrance. Most of them laughed, some chased each other across the grass, while a few nervously stood near their parents. It looked normal. It looked foreign. She turned to him slowly. Her voice was so small he almost missed it. "What if they don't like me?" The words hit Brandon like a punch to the chest. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. They weren't said with fear. They were said with certainty, like she already believed the answer might be no. He leaned forward, resting his arm across the seat so he could meet her eyes. "They don't know you yet," he said gently. "Give them a chance to find out who you are. That's all you have to do." Macy looked at him, really looked at him, as if she was trying to decide whether to believe him. Her brown eyes were serious, older than any 7-year-olds had a right to be. Then, without a word, she reached for the door handle and stepped out into the morning. Brandon watched as she adjusted her backpack, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the gates. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone walking into enemy territory, not with fear, but with a deep kind of guarded bravery. He didn't call after her. He knew she didn't need a pep talk or a promise. She needed space to be strong on her own terms. And she was. When she reached the steps, a teacher spotted her and smiled, leaning down to greet her. Macy gave a polite nod, barely audible from where Brandon sat. Then she walked inside. Brandon didn't drive away. He sat in the car for a long time, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the place where she had disappeared. His mind wasn't on meetings or emails. It was on Macy, on her courage, on that heartbreaking question. What if they don't like me? She wasn't asking for popularity. She was asking if she deserved to belong. And Brandon Ellis, once the untouchable man who ruled from boardrooms and hotel towers, realized something that morning. She wasn't the one who needed to prove herself. He was. And he'd never been more ready to try. The apartment was quiet when Brandon returned that evening, the city's golden hour light barely touching the cracked blinds. He placed the grocery bag on the counter and looked around. The nurse had just left. Darlene was resting, the rhythmic hiss of her oxygen tank the only sound in the room. The apartment still bore the weight of poverty, too small, too dim, too tired, but something in the air had shifted in recent days. It felt lived in. Not like survival anymore. Like life. He glanced at the clock. 3:47 p.m. School had let out nearly an hour ago. He caught himself checking the hallway through the peephole every few seconds, restless. Ridiculous, he thought. He had a meeting with a regional investor in 45 minutes and hadn't even opened the file yet. But his thoughts weren't on profit margins or renovation timelines. They were on a 7-year-old girl walking home for the first time with a backpack too big for her frame. Then came the sound. The soft thud of light feet on the stairs. The jingle of the worn doorknob. And finally, the creak of the door as it opened slowly. Macy stood there, framed by the hallway light, her cheeks flushed from the walk, her oversized sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, and that new blue backpack slung proudly over both arms. Her hair was a little messy, her socks didn't match, and her shoes were wet from a puddle she clearly hadn't dodged. But she was smiling. Not a full grin. Not loud or boastful. Just a small, quiet smile, the kind that said she had seen something today that made her believe the world might not always be so cruel. Brandon watched her take 3 slow steps into the apartment. She kicked off her shoes near the door, dropped her bag on the chair, and let out a long, tired breath. "I got to write my name on a chalkboard today," she said suddenly, like she had been saving the words just for him. Brandon blinked. It was so small. So ordinary. And yet he felt his chest tighten. "That's a pretty big deal," he replied gently. She nodded. "It felt like mine. The name, I mean. Like I could keep it." He didn't say anything else. Just walked to the fridge, poured her a glass of water, and handed it to her without a word. She took it and sat at the table, her legs dangling off the chair, sipping slowly. They didn't talk about her classes. Or what the other kid said. Or whether she ate lunch. They just sat together in the soft light of a setting sun, the quiet between them rich with something deeper than words. She didn't lean on him that day. Didn't fall asleep on his shoulder. But for the first time, she came home. And he realized that meant more than he could ever say. Brandon Ellis had never thought of himself as the type to memorize a school calendar. His world had always been dictated by quarterly earnings, property deals, and high-stakes negotiations. But in the weeks since Macy had entered his life, something in him had shifted, quietly, powerfully, and without permission. His mornings now began not with espresso and spreadsheets, but with pouring orange juice into a plastic cup while a 7-year-old girl adjusted the laces on her brand-new sneakers. While he used to monitor global markets before the sun rose, he now found himself packing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and asking whether she preferred apple slices or crackers for her snack. Brandon still took investor calls and met with his executive team. But beneath every decision, every data point, was a new rhythm, one shaped by Macy's schedule. He had alarms on his phone now for things he'd once scoffed at: pick Macy up, 3:15, Gloria's meds, 8 p.m., parent-teacher check-in, Friday. The strangest part? He didn't resent it. He actually looked forward to the sound of Macy's footsteps running down the school sidewalk. He found comfort in her stories about her day, how her math teacher smelled like peppermints, or how she had finally memorized all the months of the year in order. She recited her facts with pride and an intensity that made him ache. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was growing. Gloria's condition remained fragile, but there were good days now. She could speak in full sentences. Sometimes she even smiled. Brandon had made sure her medical needs were covered, upgraded bedding, specialized medication, and a nurse who came daily. It was more than duty. It was dignity. The apartment, once heavy with silence and stale air, was now full of life. Crayon drawings covered the fridge. Macy's school backpack sat proudly by the door each evening. Some nights, they cooked together, boxed macaroni and microwaved peas. But they laughed. They burned toast. They argued about whether bedtime should be 8 o'clock or 8:30. It was a family, messy and real. Still, Brandon couldn't ignore the undercurrent inside him, a low, persistent fear. This had all happened so fast. What if it fell apart? What if one call or one misstep undid everything? Why had this child cracked him open? He didn't have all the answers. But the look Macy gave him when she whispered, "You came back," stayed with him. That single sentence had undone years of distance he had wrapped around his heart. Because for the first time in his life, Brandon wasn't just offering protection. He wasn't just giving someone a place to stay. He was letting himself stay. And in doing so, he discovered something he had never expected to find in a cluttered little apartment with peeling walls and the hum of an oxygen machine. He belonged to someone. And that made all the difference. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty apartment window, casting long golden streaks across the floor where Macy sat hunched over the small kitchen table. Her notebook lay open in front of her, pages slightly curled, pencil smudges streaking the edges. Her tongue poked out the side of her mouth in concentration as she scribbled with a pencil that had seen better days. Brandon Ellis, leaning quietly in the doorway, watched her without speaking. Something about the scene, the light, the silence, the steadiness of her focus, stirred something deep in him. He had just returned from a board meeting, one where powerful men and women had debated investment margins and expansion strategies. But none of that felt real anymore. Not compared to this, to a little girl with pencil on her fingers and the weight of an entire world on her 7-year-old shoulders. "What are you working on?" he asked gently, stepping closer. Macy looked up, startled, then shrugged, guarding the page with her arm. "It's for school. We're writing about our families." Brandon smiled and crouched beside her. "Can I see?" She hesitated, chewing her lip, then slid the notebook across the table. "Don't laugh." He took the notebook carefully, as though it were something sacred. And in a way, it was. Written in shaky but determined handwriting were the words. "My name is Macy. I live in a small place, but it is warm. My grandma is very sick, but I help her and she still loves me. I used to clean rooms because we didn't have anything. Then one day, a man opened a door. He didn't yell. He didn't tell me to leave. He asked if I was okay. He said I should be a kid. I didn't believe him, but he came back. He keeps coming back." Brandon's throat tightened. His hands, so steady in business negotiations, trembled slightly as he held the page. The words hit harder than any speech, any courtroom declaration, any thank you he had ever received. This wasn't a story about pity or rescue, it was about showing up. About staying. He looked up at her, but Macy was already back to writing, as if what she had shared wasn't life-changing. As if it hadn't split his world wide open. "You really think I keep coming back?" he asked, voice quieter than usual. She glanced sideways, not stopping her pencil. "Don't you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward and gently touched her hand. "Macy. I'll never stop coming back. Not now. Not ever." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. That was all. Brandon handed the notebook back and stood, turning away so she wouldn't see the way his eyes burned. In all his years, with all his wealth, no one had ever written about him that way. Not with honesty. Not with belonging. In Macy's story, he wasn't just a character. He was home. That night, after Macy had fallen asleep curled up on the couch with one of her new library books draped across her chest, Brandon Ellis stood at the window of the small apartment, watching the city lights blur behind streaks of drizzle. The hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tick of the clock were the only sounds in the room, but his mind was loud. Everything had changed so quickly. What had started as a single moment of curiosity, a knock at his hotel room door, had spiraled into something deeper, something real. He looked over at Macy's small figure, breathing evenly under the blanket, her thin arms wrapped around the book like it was a treasure. A child who had scrubbed hotel floors instead of going to second grade. A girl who had never been allowed to just be a kid. He knew now, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not ever. Brandon stepped into the kitchen, took out his phone, and stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he tapped a number he hadn't used in over a year. "Ron, it's Brandon," he said when the voice answered. "I need to talk about guardianship. Temporary to start, but I want to begin the process." His longtime lawyer didn't respond right away. "Are you sure?" he asked, careful and calm. Brandon closed his eyes and took a breath. "She has no one. Her grandmother's hanging on by a thread. Macy needs more than just visits or groceries or school books. She needs someone who stays." Ron sighed. "All right. I'll get things moving. Background checks, intent statements, the works." After they hung up, Brandon didn't sit back down. Instead, he walked to the table, pulled out a pen and paper, and began writing his statement of intent. The legal document would become part of the guardianship petition, a cold, formal requirement. But as his pen moved across the page, the words that came out were anything but cold. He described how they met. The rag in her hand. Her small voice saying she was assigned to the floor. The apartment filled with silence and dust. The hunger in her eyes, both literal and emotional. He wrote about the slow way trust had formed, not through grand gestures, but through showing up, again and again. Then he paused. "What do I write that explains why?" He stared down at the page. After a long minute, he wrote one final line. "I'm not doing this for her to belong to me. I'm doing this because I finally know what it means to belong to someone." The moment he put down the pen, he felt it in his chest, a quiet, unshakable certainty. This was no longer about generosity or guilt. It was about love. It was about purpose. And as he turned off the lights and checked on Macy one last time, pulling the blanket gently over her shoulder, he understood the truth. He hadn't saved her. She had saved him. And this was just the beginning. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle as Brandon and Macy walked under the same umbrella, their footsteps echoing down the quiet sidewalk. The city seemed softer today, less sharp, less demanding. Brandon had picked Macy up from school early without warning. She had paused when she saw him standing beside the car, her small eyebrows drawing together in concern. "Am I in trouble?" she asked cautiously, her backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. Brandon smiled. "Not even close. I just thought we could do something different today." She studied him for a second longer, trying to read the truth in his face. Then, wordlessly, she climbed into the car. They drove through the city in silence, the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them, quiet, but never cold. When the sleek car pulled up to a narrow brick building with tall windows and carved wooden doors, Macy tilted her head. "The library?" she asked, surprised. Brandon nodded. "You've never been, right?" She shook her head slowly. "I called ahead. They've got a library card with your name on it." Inside, the building smelled of paper and wood polish, old pages, and possibility. Tall shelves stretched toward the ceiling, and warm golden light poured through the windows, turning the floor into patches of sunshine. Macy's wide brown eyes flicked from book to book, then back to Brandon as if silently asking if this was real. He nodded once. "Anything you want. Take your time." She moved slowly at first, letting her fingers brush the spines of books as if they were delicate treasures. Brandon didn't follow her. He kept his distance, letting her explore on her own, letting her feel, if only for a while, that this space belonged to her. Eventually, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor near the back corner, engrossed in a book so large it nearly swallowed her. He crouched beside her, careful not to interrupt too loudly. "Find something good?" he asked, softly. Without looking up, she held up the cover. It was an illustrated novel about a girl who built a flying machine out of scrap metal and dreams. Brandon studied the cover, then looked at her with quiet admiration. "That one's you." She rolled her eyes in disbelief. "I don't build machines," she muttered. He smiled and leaned in. "No. You build futures. That's harder." For a moment, she didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on the page, but something in her posture shifted, a slight softening of her shoulders, a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Are you nervous about the court?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon didn't lie. "Yeah. I am." "Me too." They sat in silence after that, surrounded by books and stories, by shelves lined with hundreds of lives, and for once, neither of them needed to fill the silence. It was enough to just be there, side by side, two people who had somehow found each other, building something stronger than machines, building trust, building family. Building a future. The courtroom was smaller than Brandon had imagined, no grandeur, no high drama, just pale beige walls, a polished floor, and the quiet hum of a ceiling fan slicing through the silence. It was late morning in downtown Chicago, and the guardianship hearing for Macy Carter had just been called to order. Brandon Ellis, dressed in a navy suit more subdued than his usual boardroom armor, sat upright on the front bench. But this time, he wasn't defending profits, he was defending a promise. Beside him sat Macy, her small frame wrapped in a pale yellow dress she'd chosen herself that morning. Her legs dangled from the bench, her shiny new shoes barely brushing the floor. She held her hands tightly in her lap, her posture tense but composed. She didn't speak. She didn't squirm. But Brandon could see the worry sitting on her shoulders, the fear that this, like everything else, might slip away. When the judge, a woman with kind but tired eyes, asked Brandon to stand and speak, he did so with a quiet, grounded authority. No notes. No rehearsed speech. Just truth. He told them how they met, how Macy had knocked on his hotel door holding a rag instead of a toy. How she'd walked into his room like she belonged there, and how that moment had changed everything. He described the apartment, the illness, the silence he couldn't unsee, and the child who had carried the weight of an adult world with grace no child should ever have to bear. He didn't try to sound heroic. He admitted he hadn't known what he was doing at first. But somewhere along the way, he realized he didn't want to walk away. "She's my family now," he said, voice firm. The words settled into the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Then the judge turned to Macy. "Do you want to live with Mr. Ellis?" she asked softly. Macy looked up at Brandon, then back at the judge. Her voice, when it came, was small, but it carried. "He came back. No one ever came back before." There was a beat of silence. Then the judge nodded slowly. "Let the record reflect," she said gently, "guardianship granted." In that moment, something in Brandon cracked wide open, and what spilled out wasn't just relief. It was love. Real. Permanent. Unshakable. When Brandon and Macy stepped back into the apartment that evening, the warm smell of garlic bread still lingered from dinner. The lights were dimmed to a soft golden hue, and the sound of the rain outside had faded to a quiet patter. On the small kitchen table sat something unexpected, a simple wooden frame propped up beside a glass of water. Brandon tilted his head and stepped closer. Inside the frame was one of Macy's older drawings, the one she had made weeks ago. The one with the lopsided house, two small figures, and a tall man beside them. But now, a fourth figure had been added, another stick person with a tie, holding the little girl's hand beneath a big, uneven heart. The lines were uneven, the colors slightly smudged, but the message was crystal clear. Above the house, written in thick red crayon, was a single word, home. Brandon's breath caught. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Macy stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on the drawing like it was something sacred. She didn't ask if he liked it. She didn't explain what it meant. She just watched him, as if waiting to see if he understood. And he did. Every silent dinner, every school drop-off, every late-night pharmacy run, every smile she tried not to show, this drawing captured it all. It wasn't about the art. It was about the belonging. A child who once cleaned hotel rooms to survive had finally drawn a picture of a home. Not a mansion. Not a hotel suite. Just a home, with him in it. Brandon knelt down and looked Macy in the eye. "You made this?" She nodded. "Grandma said it should be framed. She said families don't always look like people think they should. Sometimes, they're chosen." A tightness gripped Brandon's chest as he opened his arms. Macy didn't hesitate. She ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. He held her close, his heart full and aching at once. In that moment, Brandon Ellis knew, whatever came next, he wasn't going anywhere. He was hers. And she, finally, was home. Brandon Ellis stood in the middle of the tiny living room, still holding the crayon drawing in his hands. The paper was slightly wrinkled from Macy's small fingers, but he smoothed it out gently, his eyes locked on the childlike illustration, for stick figures beneath a crooked red heart. A girl, a grandmother, a man in a tie, and a house drawn with wide windows and a tall tree. Above it, in Macy's careful handwriting, was one word, home. He looked up, and there she was, Macy, watching him with a mix of anticipation and caution. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She just waited, like she always did, hoping but never quite expecting. Brandon dropped to one knee and opened his arms. Without a word, Macy ran into him. Her tiny frame collided with his chest, and her arms wrapped around his waist with a desperation that shattered something deep inside him. He held her tighter than he thought he could, his hand cradling the back of her head, anchoring her there as though the world might try to pull her away again. But not this time. Not ever again. Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He couldn't. Not now. This wasn't about him. This was about her. About the girl who once knocked on a stranger's door carrying nothing but a rag and silent dignity, and unknowingly carried his entire future in that moment. For years, Brandon Ellis had been known as the man with power, the man who built empires and crushed competition. But in that cramped apartment, with old paint and flickering lights, he realized he had never truly built anything until now. He was no longer just a hotel mogul. He was a father. Not by law yet, but by choice. And that choice, that sacred, irreversible decision, meant more than any deal he'd ever made. Macy looked up at him, her cheek pressed against his chest. "Is this, forever?" she whispered. Brandon pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "With everything I have," he said. "Forever starts now." And in that moment, home wasn't just something she drew. It was something they became. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.